Game of Thrones' downfall is great and terrible, one of the most well-known and worst in television history. The final season was awful. The second to last season was nearly that bad, but the decline wasn't a sheer cliff. Sure, there were some pretty steep drops in quality at points, but I'd argue the true decline of one of my all-time favorite shows started far earlier. Season 4 was, for a time, my favorite season of Game of Thrones. These days, I still like it quite a bit. It has some really high highs, but it was where the quality of the show really began to waver. While a lot of flaws are rooted in changes the showrunners made from the source material, there's still plenty on offer that is just independently bad, if significantly better than the walking corpse that was its final season. Today, I'll be discussing what I think is the first bad episode of Game of Thrones, that being Season 4, Episode 10, The Children. I don't want to waste your time. My main thesis is this. I think The Children works perfectly as a metaphor for the entirety of Game of Thrones as a series, and I've never really seen it discussed this way before. It starts out amazing. Great scenes that are largely accurate to the source material and that follow up on epic climaxes well established in the story's past. As it goes on, things begin to noticeably shift. Scenes begin to lose their purpose. Changes from the book begin to happen left and right. And the motivating factor behind all of these changes largely seems to be immediate convenience while ignoring future storytelling potential. A big dumb fight happens, and before a scene that is okay but could be 50 times better if two tiny elements from the source material were maintained. And ultimately, it all ends with Arya Stark sailing away from Westeros. It's the most Game of Thrones episode of Game of Thrones to ever Game of Thrones. I do think I should clarify the title a little bit. While I think there are good scenes in The Children, the season 4 finale, I think it's the first episode of Game of Thrones that is more bad than good. And I think, as I laid out earlier, it is a very good indication of the problems of the series to come. I also want to ask you, what do you think is the first bad episode of Game of Thrones? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It is free and it's much appreciated. On to the analysis. From here, I'm going to break down my thoughts scene by scene in an attempt to dissect why this episode does not work for me. That gets off on a difficult note because I think this episode has quite an excellent opening. Jon Snow goes north of the Wall after this massive battle for Castle Black, an attempt to negotiate with Mance, which is really an assassination attempt. Both actors, Jon and Mance, do an incredible job, and honestly, I think this is my favorite performance Kit Harington ever gives as Jon Snow. He's weary from the battle, and he's ready to die to preserve the Watch, which really channels Book Jon at the end of Storm quite well. I think that element of the character, this duty-bound, kind of honorable but willing to die for a cause part of Jon, is something that Kit does really well, as opposed to Jon's more subtle political acting later on in the series. Stannis' arrival here is also excellent, as are his interactions with both Jon and Mance. It really shows off the importance of mounted cavalry in this type of warfare, and that appeals to the history nerd in my brain for some reason. Also, I love the music at Stannis' introduction. It's really dark and ominous, if I could speak. I always have trouble saying that word. With that said, this scene is not perfect. I really don't know why Davos is here, and the show never really quite figures it out either. He eventually goes south with Stannis, only to be sent north again, and then gets stuck babysitting Jon for all of seasons 6 and 7. To finish the pot at the wall quickly and skip ahead a couple scenes, I also quite enjoy Jon's ending this season, that being his burning of Ygritte. I do wish he'd also gotten his election to Lord Commander this episode, but they do it pretty well in Season 5's premiere. We then effectively swapped to Cersei's viewpoint for a trio of scenes, two of which I also quite like. The scene between Pycelle and Qyburn does a great job of following up on the trial by combat from episode 8 in a satisfying way, and it honestly feels like it's ripped right out of the pages of A Feast for Crows. Qyburn's actor is also fantastic here, especially in these earlier seasons, and then Cersei goes over to pull Tywin for a chat, which is a show-only scene because Cersei's not a viewpoint at this point, and I really enjoy it. Cersei's betrothal is much more of an imminent and cemented event in the show, largely due to the third book being split across 2 seasons. In the text, it's unclear who she's going to marry and when, as everything goes crazy once Joffrey dies, and things are kind of a dead heat race to the finish in A Storm of Swords. In the show, there's time to breathe. The wedding is determined, she is going to marry Loras Tyrell, but Cersei, being backed into a corner, is always fun and often produces her best and worst results. See seasons 1 and 5, respectively. effectively. Her choice to tell Tywin about her relationship with Jaime feels entirely natural for the character once she's pushed to the brink like this, as does Tywin remaining within his own perception and delusion, denying the possibility in response. Unfortunately, this is the final scene that I fully like in this episode, as all of the rest of it has very obvious flaws. The third Cersei scene, the one between Jaime and Cersei, is where things go fully off the rails for me. I do not like it. Jaime is framed as sitting here and considering the White Book, this record of all of the previous Kingsguard, and his place and vows thereof. Cersei then comes in, they have a chat, they hook up. In the text, this goes the exact opposite way. In Jaime's final chapter of A Storm of Swords, he dismisses Cersei's advances for the sake of his honor and his duty over this journey he's taken throughout this entire book. In the show, it's the exact opposite. This is the core moment where Jaime's redemption arc takes a nosedive in the show as compared to the text. Cersei acts as a representation of Jaime's past and his worst impulses. By choosing not to engage with that, engage with her and their unhealthy relationship, Jaime is able to move on and better himself as a person. And we see him diverge from Cersei's path and eventually clean up the Riverlands during a Feast for Crows. In the show, Jaime just ends up doing Cersei's bidding until the end of season 7. That's likely the equivalent to the end of the Winds of Winter in the books, or even beyond that. In contrast, Jaime fully separates his interest from Cersei's at the end of the 4th book in the series, A Feast for Crows, as he burns a letter requesting that he fight on her behalf in a trial by combat, and he's likely on a much different and more positive path because of it in the text. I don't have a ton to say about the one Daenerys scene we get this episode. I think the development of chaining her dragons is good as it is in Dance, and it serves as a great metaphor for her time attempting to rule in Meereen. It does seem pretty disconnected from the other parts of this episode, and it verges on feeling like the writers were just obligated to give us a Daenerys scene in the season finale. I think this might have worked better at the beginning of season 5 rather than the end of season 4, as it could contrast with her flying away on the never-chained Drogon near the end of that season. Bran's arrival at Bloodraven's cave has been torn to death by critics over the past decade since it airs, so I'm going to keep this section as brief as I can. The scene in concept is fine. Pretty much exactly the same thing happens during Bran's second chapter in A Dance with Dragons. Whites attack the group as they arrive at Bloodraven's cave. With that said, the scene goes completely insane from that baseline in the show. Thomas Brody Sangster had a funny bit in an interview where he talked about just the absolute overkill of Jojen's death to the point that it's like TJ Miller in that one Transformers movie. And it's utterly bonkers. He gets grabbed by a white, stabbed 4 times in the gut, and then blown up by a magical fireball. This is the most Dungeons and Dragons scene in all of Game of Thrones, and I unfortunately do not mean that in a good way. The Children of the Forest hurling fireballs out of nowhere and only doing it one other time in the entire series is frankly bizarre and pretty directly contradicts a lot of the details surrounding their legendary history. I get that they probably had weapons to defend themselves from the First Men, but those weapons were likely the others, as is established by season 6, and not literally grenades. Also, Jojen's death is a mountain of missed potential. As someone mentioned in a comment in one of my recent videos, his likely book death is such a great moment of organic shock that Dungeons & Dragons just skipped over for convenience. I won't get into exactly what that death is here. I'll link to a video in the cards explaining it. And also, furthermore, I think that the CGI white in the sunlight looks awful. It's not as bad as the White Walker mask in House of the Dragon, but still. Brienne and the Hound's duel is another commonly cited problem, and it's the big dumb fight I'd mentioned in my thesis. Out the gate, I think that Arya mischaracterizes Ned. Yes, he didn't want her to fight, as evidenced by his PTSD flashbacks at the end of one of the episodes in season 1, but he did hire Syrio to teach her how. That's pretty great as far as Game of Thrones dads go, and it honestly sounds exactly like what Brienne's dad did, just with that dad actually taking the reins of the training himself. The Hound's protectiveness of Arya does make some sense, but the escalation from here really doesn't. They're trying to kind of take something from A Feast for Crows, that being Brienne being attacked by the Brotherhood for her sword being Lannister gold and Tommen's decree to get Sansa, but they remove some of the reasoning surrounding this and why it goes so poorly. There are 2 key reasons as to why Brienne can't talk her way out of the situation with the Brotherhood, those being Lady Stoneheart's desire for blind justice and vengeance, and her having sustained serious injuries in the previous chapter, limiting her ability to communicate clearly. Here, there's no excuse. This scene just sort of feels like the writers are mashing 2 action figures together, making them fight just to fight. I think it could have been explained if Arya and the Hound had any sort of plan or destination at this point in the story, but they really don't, and they have no reason to be so hostile to Brienne. Also, the fight in and of itself gives me motion sickness due to the insane camera movement. I think there's exactly one cool thing that happens in the duel itself, that being Sandor grabbing the blade. I think it's super in character for him, and it's a nice touch. I also like the resolution, Arya leaving the Hound behind, but they did also already have him sustain some injuries from Biter earlier on in the season. He could have just succumbed to the infection like happens in the books, so all around just unnecessary. The final scene in this episode is the big one, Tyrion's escape and the deaths of Shae and Tywin. There are two massive pain points here, one discussed a million times, the other considerably less so. The first is obviously the omission of the UnTysha Confession. For those who don't know, during Tyrion's escape in A Storm of Swords, Jaime admits that Tywin forced him to lie about Tyrion's first wife, that she wasn't a prostitute and her love for Tyrion was real. This is an earth-shattering revelation to Tyrion, particularly in light of the atrocities committed against Tysha when Tywin found out about the wedding. Tyrion then lashes out at Jaime, falsely admitting that he did indeed kill Joffrey, and truthfully shedding light on some of Cersei's infidelity, though not the Moon Boy part. That thought echoing throughout Jaime's chapters in A Feast for Crows, and resulting in further deterioration of the sibling relationship. I have a thought as to why this confession was omitted, but it is tied into my next point. Shae's death is the other big change. In the show, she grabs a knife and attempts to stab Tyrion once he walks into Tywin's bedchamber. Tyrion is unarmed at that point and ends up strangling her with a chain in self-defense. In the book, Shae does nothing of the sort. She tells Tyrion she's scared and pleads for his help. In response, Tyrion strangles this young, unarmed girl to death with the chain of office for the hand of the king. Martin has described this act as the main black mark on Tyrion's soul and a massive burden of guilt with which the character struggles. Killing Tywin is one thing. Tywin is a monster who had condemned Tyrion to death and tortured him all his life. Shae was truly an innocent, and killing her is one of Tyrion's darkest acts. David and Dan were completely unwilling to adapt Tyrion's arc in A Dance with Dragons. I'm fine with parts of that. He has plenty of boring chapters in Dance. What I'm not okay with is losing the character. Tyrion is in an incredibly dark place. He's downright evil for most of A Dance with Dragons, and the showrunners liked Tyrion so much that they decided to take his character in a different direction. Show Tyrion as a saint, even apologizing to Shae's corpse after killing her in supposed self-defense. Dinklage did an excellent job with some of Tyrion's darker moments in Season 4, most notably his trial speech, and I think he would have killed the villainous arc on which Tyrion is currently set in the book. Alas, such a turn will never be seen on television. All of these things combined make The Children a very weak episode of Game of Thrones in my eyes, despite some strong elements at the start. I would say it's the beginning of the end. What do you think of this episode? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments down below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I appreciate it, and it helps grow the channel a lot. I talk about Dunk and Egg, Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, all that stuff a ton. I will have videos coming out probably about one a week going forward here, because I do have finals coming up, and I am quite busy being a law student, so I appreciate any support that you all can give during these trying times, and I will see you for more videos in the very near future, including a Jon video and a Cersei video, both of which I'm working on, and both of which are shaping up quite well. I'll see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.